founder and visionary for M.A.P.S, Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. All right.
Wow, thank you very much. This is also my last talk for all of Burning Man, so if you've been saving up difficult questions, you can use them now. So what I'd like to talk about, and then I would encourage you to ask questions during my talk. If you just raise your hand, and I think we can get a mic to you or something like that. You don't have to wait till the end. If you have questions, better just to ask when you have them. And so what I want to talk about before we get into more questions and stuff is a little bit about how we got into this situation where we're completely rejected by FDA, where the media has turned negative, where there's just lots and lots of frustration. I would say probably $200 million of valuation or more has been lost at Lycos. We're in a difficult situation. And I'll talk just a bit about how we got here, but I'm mostly going to talk about what do we do now and how do we go forward. And I think one of the myths that I've been thinking about a lot is the phoenix. And the phoenix gets old and it gets sort of past its lifespan, and then it burns up and it burns to a crisp, and there's just ashes left, and then something emerges again, the new phoenix. So I feel that we're in this stage where we've been burnt to the crisp, and we're in the total ashes stage of what we have tried to accomplish, which has crashed and burned. And so I think one of the things that has happened is that the FDA, I believe, really did want to approve MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD, and one would think that all you need is the right data, but the way that psychedelics have been in our culture, the way psychedelics have been for thousands of years, they've been very, very controversial, since 396 or so, when the Catholic Church wiped out the Eleusinian Mysteries. That's really the last time that psychedelics have been integrated fully into Western culture. We did have this period during the 50s and 60s where there was enormous interest in psychedelics and a lot of research studies, and it was the hottest thing in psychiatry, and actually LSD led to the discovery of serotonin and to the neurotransmitters, that people were unclear. How could something so tiny as LSD have such a profound impact on your consciousness? And then the theory was there must be something like it in the brain, these sort of little chemical messengers, and that led to the search and the discovery of serotonin. So LSD in the 50s and 60s, also with mescaline, psilocybin, was just an enormous area of research, and then it got caught up in the counterculture, in the protests against the Vietnam War, and then was the backlash. And the backlash was political, not really scientific. And the backlash was so strong or so powerful that not only did they wipe out and criminalize non-medical use of psychedelics, but the research into psychedelics was wiped out for multiple decades. And not just in the United States, but all over the world. And so that was kind of a brief period where psychedelics weren't fully integrated. They were very controversial, but that was another blip. So now we're more or less a bit more than half a century after that. And there's been a new psychedelic renaissance, and interest has returned. And what we're hoping is that in August, this would culminate with FDA approval of MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. We had two very successful, I'll go back. We started M.A.P.S in 86 after MDMA was criminalized in 85. We won a lawsuit against the DEA to try to keep MDMA available as a medicine, but the head of the Drug Enforcement Administration decided that they had the power to ignore the recommendation of the judge and keep it criminalized both for non-medical and medical use anyway. So I started M.A.P.S in 86 as a non-profit psychedelic pharmaceutical company. And it took us till 1992 before the FDA approved a single study. We had 5 protocols rejected. Then in 92, we started getting the phase 1 dose response safety studies. And that went through the 90s, and then we started working with PTSD. Our first one was in Spain in 1999 and 2000 with women survivors of sexual abuse. And the study was going well, and then the National Institute on Drug Abuse sent researchers that had focused on the neurotoxicity of MDMA to Spain to speak, and then that turned the attitude against what we were doing, and so the study was shut down for political reasons. Then we came back to the US and began the research, and that took 16 years till 2016, where we had phase 2 studies, small pilot studies, where you try to figure out how to design phase 3. And they were in Israel, Canada, and the US. So already we're starting to think internationally, and we're trying to really get other countries and other regulatory agencies involved. And that went really well. And at the end of 2016, we had this meeting with FDA to go to phase 3, and FDA said yes. But I knew that most pharmaceutical companies, once they get permission to go to phase 3, that's what they do. They've got patents or whatever, time matters. But I knew that we had real scientific methodological problems with the double-blind. How do you do a double-blind study with psychedelics? So the FDA has this program called Special Protocol Assessment, where you can voluntarily engage with them to negotiate every single aspect of your phase 3 design. And that took us 8 months to do. And at the very end, what we came up with was how to deal with the double-blind problem. And what had happened was that my dissertation, which was in 2001, I thought I solved the problem. And the way that I thought the problem should be solved is that you use therapy with low-dose MDMA versus therapy with full-dose MDMA. And the challenge is to find the dose of MDMA that's high enough so that you notice it, and you start thinking, maybe this is a full dose, I don't know, but not so high so that it's so therapeutic that you can't really find a difference between the two groups, because you've now got 2 therapeutic doses. So that was my solution, because if you use inactive placebo, you can all, I'm sure, tell them apart. If you all had a pill of MDMA and half of you had MDMA, half of you had inactive placebo, probably by an hour and a half, 90% or 95% would be sure what you got. If you use other active placebos, like there's been a lot of work with niacin, which gives you a flush, in the work with psilocybin, but that fails as a double-blind. Everybody knows that after a while. I did a 25-year follow-up to the Good Friday experiment that was done in 1962, the first study ever to see if psychedelics, in this case psilocybin, could precipitate a mystical experience in religiously inclined people in a religious setting. And one of them that I interviewed said that they had got this drug, and they had these flushes, and they thought they were so lucky now that they'd actually got the psilocybin. And they went to the bathroom, and there was this guy that just got hypnotized by this candlelight. And he was like, "Do you see the magic in that candlelight?" And then they realized that they got the placebo. So niacin doesn't work as a placebo. When you talk about tranquilizers as a placebo, therapists can tell it apart. Patients know enough in the informed consent form that they could recognize it too. Also, stimulants are difficult. When you look at people that have PTSD, they self-medicate with alcohol, with cannabis, with opiates, with downers. They don't self-medicate with stimulants. So there is this question of, is that provocative about bringing out more difficult experiences, but also stimulants don't have the heart-opening effects of MDMA, so it's difficult to really blind using stimulants. So I thought the test drug, but in a lower dose. And then everybody knows they're going to get psilocybin. Everybody knows they're going to get MDMA. And so we studied therapy with inactive placebo versus therapy with 25 milligrams or 30 milligrams, 40 milligrams, 50 milligrams, 75, 125, and 100. And the way we do it is we give an initial dose of these amounts, and then 2 hours later we give half the initial amount as a supplemental dose. And the purpose of that is not to make it stronger, but it's to make it longer. And so it turns into an 8-hour therapy session. Now, I'm not sure if you've heard of the research that neuroscientist Doblin has done. And she's done work on what's called critical periods, the sort of neuroplasticity, that your brain is open for a period of time after you take different psychedelics. And so she's done animal studies to compare how long this critical period, and that's a real optimum time for integration work, how long does it stay open? And she's looked at psilocybin, at LSD, at ibogaine, at MDMA, and I think some others. And what she's shown is that the critical period for MDMA is a couple weeks. It can be almost 6-7 weeks for LSD, but for ibogaine it's even longer. And so what she showed is that the longer you are in the psychedelic state, the longer this critical period is open. So there are a lot of benefits, for example, from doing like 5-MeO DMT for 10 minutes in a therapy session. It brings up a lot of material, and then you can work with it in the next hour or two. So it's kind of efficient, and it fits with the current kind of therapy processes that are being offered to people. But when you do something like that, the critical period for integration is shorter. So I think a lot of the for-profit pharma companies are really trying to think about how to make new drugs, how to make shorter drugs, but it's more about fitting into the current system. So we end up, I think what we need to do, ideally, is to show that the benefits are so great from whatever we're doing that the system itself will change. And one of the signs of that has been that the American Medical Association has created, M.A.P.S partnered with M.A.P.S, or the M.A.P.S Public Benefit Corporation partnered with M.A.P.S to negotiate new billing codes for long therapy sessions, and that was granted. So now, normally a therapy session is an hour, but you can bill for now 6 hours or 8 hours according to these new codes. So that was the thought, is that the system should change around the healing, maximize the healing, then the system will change. All right, so what we found when we looked at all these different doses of the MDMA was that I was partially right in the sense that these lower doses, once you start getting into the 25, 30, 40 milligrams, 50 milligrams, they're having experiences, and they're a little bit more confusion, is it that dose or is it the full dose? But what we discovered, to my surprise, was that those people that had the lower doses, now these are not healthy people in a sense, they're severe PTSD people, but the lower doses made them uncomfortable. It was like you're activated, but you don't have enough of the fear reduction. So it's in this halfway place. And I use the metaphor of an airplane, and you're in the turbulence when you take off at the beginning, and then you gotta kind of get high enough. So it's a little bit different than the microdosing theory, or practice. I think microdosing like that works better for the classic psychedelics than it does for MDMA. But what we showed is that while it made people uncomfortable, they still showed progress in the reduction of their PTSD symptoms. But those people that got therapy with no MDMA did better than those people that got therapy with low dose. Then what we discovered, also to my surprise, was that the 75 milligram dose group was really effective. We did a study with firefighters, veterans, and police officers. Now, a lot of what we do, I've talked about it, is it is real science, but it's political science, meaning that we have a political overlay of who we're trying to treat, how we talk about it. So this particular study, I didn't think we'd get any police officers, but I thought if the study says veterans, firefighters, and police officers, it sends a message that this is for everybody in the culture, and that we're even trying to help those people that have been professionally going after drugs and criminalizing and supporting prohibition. So this study had 30 milligram, one group was 75 milligram, one group was 125 milligram. And the 75 milligram dose group did the best, even more than the 125. Now, when you randomize things, they're not always equal, and so there was a lot more depression with the PTSD in the group that had the 125 milligrams. So that might have accounted for some of it, but it really woke us up that these lower doses, particularly with people that have never done psychedelics before and who have really profound traumas, that to start in a lower way gives them a feel for the medicine. They don't necessarily feel overwhelmed in some ways, and it can be a real good way. So we've changed our protocols that of the 3 MDMA sessions in the treatment is 42 hours of therapy, 3 MDMA sessions, 1 month apart, 12 90-minute non-drug psychotherapy sessions, 3 before the first for preparation, building the therapeutic alliance, and then 3 integrative sessions after each MDMA session to really take advantage of these critical period openings and the neuroplasticity and to try to anchor the benefits. And so there's a total of 12 of these 90 minutes sessions. And the first one now is 80 milligrams, followed by 40, and then the therapists and the patients talk it over. Do they want to go to a higher dose? And over about 95% of the people do go up to the 120 and then the 60 milligrams, and then about 95% of them stay at that dose. So what we learned in this study with the veterans, firefighters, and police officers, we did get 1 police officer, which was pretty great also. But we learned that this point where the MDMA moves from being making people uncomfortable to being very therapeutic was lower than we thought. So there was no sweet spot of here's a dose that is high enough to cause confusion, meaning produce a bit more of a double blind, but then wasn't also so effective that it was actually promoting the therapeutic benefits. So I didn't feel that there was this dose that we could say to the FDA, here's the right dose for this control condition. So we went to the FDA and during the special protocol assessment process, and we said, we're happy to give you blinding. We would be happy to use these lower doses because you're going to make our job easier to find a difference between therapy with full dose MDMA and the control condition of therapy. If you let us use therapy with low dose MDMA, you get blinding, but the therapy isn't quite as effective. And what we said was that the real challenge from a scientific point of view is if you can do work with severe PTSD with therapy and you get great results, why add the drug? So we should compare MDMA-assisted therapy with the best outcomes that we get from therapy by itself, which is with inactive placebo. So there's another advantage from doing inactive placebo in the study, which is that the safety database, the severe adverse events or any kind of adverse events, if you're using a low dose amount of MDMA with the therapy with the PTSD patients, people might think, well, whatever happened is due to this MDMA. It's not really due just to the background factors. So when you have inactive placebo, you know that whatever side effects you see have nothing to do with the MDMA. And so we did have one woman try to kill herself twice in the first phase 3 study. And we had another woman had such severe suicidal ideation, she checked herself into a hospital not to kill herself. And both were in the placebo group. So what we could say is that when you work with severe PTSD patients and you try to do therapy, it's difficult for them, that they've sort of walled it off, they can never get rid of it, it's impacting their life in terrible ways. But when you try to help them work on it with therapy, but without any aid of chemistry, it can be very difficult. And so just to demonstrate that, the VA didn't intend to demonstrate that point, but the VA took about 6 years and they did a study comparing prolonged exposure, which is one of the main therapies for PTSD, where you just repeat the trauma over and over and over, and then the cognitive processing therapy, where you try to think about, every time you go into a closed room, if you were attacked in a closed room, every time you go into a closed room and you're scared, and they try to, say not all closed rooms contain this danger, try to reformulate your thinking. So these were the 2 main therapies. They did 916 veterans, took them about 6 years, but half the people dropped out from both of the therapies because the therapies are so confrontational of your trauma, and there's no fear reduction, no chemistry aid, and it's very, very difficult. So half the people dropped out. And so when you hear the results of how good prolonged exposure or cognitive processing does, you have to keep in mind that this is only the half of the people that could make it through the therapy. The other half felt, Yes, exactly. It was just, one of the things that the FDA advisory committee said was, this is such a low dropout rate. We have a hard time believing it. I think that was the judge. The results were so good that they had a hard time believing it from their frame of reference. Yeah, the advisory committee, I'll get to that in just a second, yes, but that was just one of the things. So the FDA, when we presented this idea of how to do phase 3, the FDA chose therapy with inactive placebo. They said, this is what we want you to do. And then they signed an agreement with us called Special Protocol Assessment. Yeah.
Has there been any work done with like brain spotting, or is it EMDR?
Yeah.
Has that been tried?
No, but what's interesting is that EMDR, I think, with these different therapies would be the one most likely to work well with MDMA. Because with EMDR, you're not trying to prompt people. You're not trying to say, think about your trauma now. Or it's whatever is emerging, you kind of help them. So there have not been any kind of studies blending MDMA with EMDR, but I think that would be really good. And Kismet over there has been thinking for a long time about doing exactly that study. And so people should encourage her to move forward. Because the key thing here to say is that MDMA and other psychedelics are just tools. And they are tools that could be used in all different ways. So M.A.P.S has developed this inner-directed therapy that we think is really customized for PTSD, customized for MDMA, but that MDMA can be used in other ways. So from a political point of view, with those people that have developed prolonged exposure, cognitive processing therapy, we felt that instead of us saying, oh, MDMA is great, it's better than everything, you don't need anything that you did before, what we would say to those people that had these other therapeutic approaches is, we'd like to help you learn how to blend your approach with MDMA, and maybe that will make your approach more effective. So there are studies blending MDMA with prolonged exposure that are Barbara Rothbaum in Atlanta. There are studies that are blending MDMA with cognitive processing therapy in Toronto. My favorite one is cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy. And what that is couples therapy, basically. It's conjoint means dyads or couple. It's focused on the one person with PTSD, but you bring their partner into the therapy. And the partner, often what happens is that we have an over-focus on the designated patient, but it affects the whole family system. And a lot of times the rest of the family don't get the attention. And so this idea was cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy, and it's evidence-based therapy used throughout the VA. And so this was the first one in 2014 that the VA said we could study blending MDMA with the originators of this therapy. The results were great, better than anything they've ever done without MDMA, both in reduction of PTSD and in relationship measures that they had for the relationship of the couple or the dyad. So we've yet to find the EMDR to combine with it. But the idea, again, is these are just tools. I think you had a question? Oh, okay. So the FDA chose this. We then proceeded to start the research in 2018, and we got this incredible outcome. I mean, it was slowed down because of COVID. We were supposed to do 100 people, and we agreed with the FDA we'd close it at 90. And if you know about statistical significance, the more subjects you have in a study, the easier it is to find statistical significance. The easier it is to see smaller differences. The more numbers you have, the easier it is to see minor differences, to sort out all the other extraneous factors. Sometimes the studies with SSRIs take hundreds and hundreds, sometimes thousands of people in the studies because the effects are so small. But we were able to get results that were pretty outstanding. So we had from a statistical significance point of view, you have to have 0.05, which means it's a 1 in 20 chance that it's random, that it's not due to your intervention. If it's 0.05, 1 in 20 chance, then it's considered statistical significance, and you need 2 of those for FDA approval, and you consider them to be kind of independent studies, so you multiply the statistics. So the first one was 0.0001, which means 1 in 10,000 chance that the results were random. And we had 2/3 of the people that had PTSD, average 14 years. This is severe PTSD. Almost all of them had tried medications, psychotherapies. We purposely, for political reasons, and also scientific, realized that we should work with the hardest cases. So we work with people who had prior attempted suicide. We didn't say that they were excluded. And what we found was that at this point, roughly a third, around 32% of the people that got the therapy without the MDMA no longer had PTSD. So the therapy itself, without MDMA, it's 8-hour therapy sessions, as I said. It's very effective because the essence of the therapeutic method, we call it inner-directed therapy, is that we support what's emerging. We don't confront people and say, now's the time to talk about your trauma. We let them come to whatever is coming up with them. So people are lying down, they have headphones on, they have eye shades, they're ready to do this. The therapy starts at 10 in the morning, so this is during the day. There's 2 therapists. One has to have a license, the other can be a student or an apprentice, something like that. Often we do male-female, but not always, just to have this idea of many people that have trauma, PTSD, either from veterans from war-related trauma or others, that those people that are resilient tend to be those that have had a pretty strong, healthy upbringing. Those people that have had a difficult childhood, they're less resilient when future traumas happen to them. We were just earlier today talking with a Navy SEAL who's gone down to Mexico for Ibogaine, and what they were saying is that many of the people that volunteered for the Navy SEALs have had childhood traumas, either of the sexual nature or just abusive or so that a lot of the people that go into the military are coming from a place of pain before they even get into the military. So having a well-functioning male-female team can be really, it's traditional, but it can be very effective in providing the kind of support that people didn't have when they grow up. We have to have 2 women teams, 2 male teams. Yeah?
So you were just saying that the 8-hour protocol, is effective even without the MDMA? Is that right?
Yeah, well, that's the control group, and the inner-directed therapy, even without MDMA, can work very well.
So, as a therapist who does take insurance, are the billing codes already in for the 8 hours? And is that something that, with the M.A.P.S training, you would recommend given without the MDMA?
Well, personally, and I'll get into the data, the MDMA makes it work even better. So I would not say, if you've got somebody that's suffering, why not do the deepest work you can? And I think as far as insurance, the AMA said, here's these new codes, but they weren't going to become operational until there was FDA approval. I'm not sure about ketamine now, but I think that there are people that can combine ketamine with therapy and you can get insurance coverage for that.
Yes.
And like, can you do this like a 2-hour session or how?
Yeah, 2 hours, 3 days a week. It just needs previous recertification.
Okay, great. So in that case, so what if you want to do 3 hours? Is that out of the limit or?
I could always argue it with the review, with the insurance review.
Okay.
I haven't tried that, but I could try to argue it. Sure.
Okay, well, now I'll just say why I recommended that as long as you're going to do it, do the therapy with the MDMA too. So 2/3 of the people, twice as many, no longer have PTSD when you add therapy with MDMA. And that's no longer having a diagnosis of PTSD. There's also another measure which is called clinically significant reductions of PTSD symptoms. So that's a 10-point drop on the measure of the clinician-administered PTSD scale. You can have a 10-point drop depending where you start and still have PTSD, but it's a noticeable difference in how your life is bothered by these symptoms. And so another 21% had clinically significant reductions of PTSD. So we basically had 88% responders. And it's important to say that we had 12% of the people that didn't respond. So it doesn't work for everybody. We really don't know yet how to predict who it's going to work with before the therapy starts. And I think that's going to be one of the big challenges, particularly for insurance companies, because they're going to want to target the money on people that are more likely to get better. So that's still unknown. Now, in the second phase 3 study, we modified it so that it was not just severe PTSD, it was moderate to severe PTSD. And the reason we did that is that if we did the study of both of them in severe PTSD, then what would likely happen is the FDA would say, oh, we're approving it for severe PTSD, but it's not something that's for, moderate or less PTSD. So the second study was moderate to severe. Of the people in the second study, which was about 104, we had 3/4 of them had severe PTSD and 1/4 had moderate PTSD. And what was astonishing to me is that the therapists who worked on the first phase 1 study were most of the ones that still worked on the second phase 3, and they'd learned a lot about how to work with this method. So 46% of the people that got therapy without any MDMA at all no longer had PTSD. Now, it's not exactly the same because they're still getting a pill, right? And it's got nothing in it. But what we showed is around 6% of the people who got inactive placebo thought they got MDMA. And about another 19% were not sure, couldn't tell, but 75% were sure they got the placebo. So when people say, oh, expectancy effect, so if you just look at the 75%, it's more or less the same results. So what we're showing is that this therapy is more effective in these harder cases that have tried other things than prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. But we had 72% who got the MDMA no longer had PTSD. And about another 16% had clinically significant reductions of PTSD. So again, around 88% response rate. So if somebody, the main side effect I would say for MDMA is the heart. It increases, blood pressure. So if somebody has a compromised heart, then maybe you just do the therapy. But at the same time, if people have hypertension, we require them to get hypertension under control, and then they have to do a stress test, and if they can pass that, then they can get MDMA. So I think in general that when people are suffering, we want to do the best that we can. So the second study was 0.0025 statistical significance, which means 1 in 2,500 chances that it was random. And so when you multiply the 1 in 10,000 by the 1 in 2,500, it's 1 in 25 million that both of these studies would show what it did, and it had nothing to do with the MDMA. So it's pretty clear that this was incredible, outstanding results. The FDA actually has a program where you have to do 2 phase 3 studies to prove safety and efficacy. But if you get 0.001, which means 1 in 1,000, then you can apply to just get approved on just 1 phase 3 study. Because if you get 1 in 20, 0.05 times 1 in 20, 0.05, that's 1 in 400. So if you get your first study is 1 in 1,000, that's better than 2 statistically significant phase 3 studies. So after we got 0.0001, we went to the FDA and we said, hey, we're done, give us permission on just 1 phase 3 study. And they said, no, we're more or less persuaded about the efficacy, but we want to see for the safety database. We want to see another study. So we continued and we did that. And so what we've had is that in the,
Sorry, that's okay.
Hi, thanks. My name is Meelis. I'm from Estonia. So maybe you can explain for me as just a simple citizen, like what can I do as a citizen in Europe versus in the US? Who do I need to approach with this topic? Maybe give some guidelines on where to start, both in Europe and in the US.
Yeah, okay, that is really great. Well, I'd say the first thing for all of us to think about is what you can do. So I look at successful social change movements, and one of the most successful was gay marriage and gay rights, even though it's under attack a lot. But what helped that happen was people coming out. So most people were closeted who were gay. They were subject to a lot of prejudice and pressure. But when people would say, I'm gay, and particularly people that were athletes or others that people would respect and say, I didn't know you were gay. Maybe being gay isn't all that bad. So I think this idea of the coming out, so we need a psychedelic coming out.
somebody needs to do a really good marketing campaign and somebody brave enough to do it.
Yes, that's exactly right, because you're putting your reputation on the line. But that's something that everybody can do that doesn't cost any money. But it could cost you reputation in certain areas. So the first thing is to think about speaking even to your families or to your friends. So the polling has gotten pretty sophisticated on why people vote for marijuana legalization. So now more than half the U.S. population lives in states where marijuana is legal. But what preceded the legalization for all use was the medicalization. So the polling shows that one of the key factors of why somebody will vote for legalizing marijuana is if they know a medical marijuana patient. They're not sure what to believe, there's all sorts of propaganda, but if you know someone that you trust and they say, hey, this helped me, that changes your mind. So that's part of this coming out. So we need people to come out, not just patients also, but just people say, this helped me with my personal spiritual growth. So, go ahead.
I heard a couple days ago you said that the Dutch committee had an opposite. So is there now like a legal precedent in Europe that I can actually approach my, I don't know, parliament member and say, hey, like look at this, the Netherlands equivalent of the FDA, looked at the data. What was the situation there?
Yeah. Okay, so this is something where, what I'll say to sort of summarize what I think went wrong, and then we'll get to this Dutch committee, is that there was two major assumptions I think that the pharma company made that were wrong. And the first one was that there had been so much social change, so much openness to psychedelics, hundreds of for-profit psychedelic companies, that the pharma company thought, and this was, at this either M.A.P.S. Public Benefit Corp or Lycos, which had changed their name to Lycos, what they thought was that we had reached the point where this was a rational process, where all that mattered was the data. And as a consequence, they ignored the culture and didn't respond, tried to impose a quiet period on M.A.P.S., on me, on themselves. So then you get this increasing negativity and there's no response. And it just grows and grows and grows. And that's what then overwhelmed the FDA advisory committee meeting. There was, so the fundamental assumption that, oh, we're just about medicine, it's just about the data.
Sorry to interrupt. Is that a political organization? I'm not aware of the U.S. So the FDA committee that you.
Well, the FDA advisory committee is appointed by the FDA. There's loads of them throughout the different agencies of the different divisions of the FDA. So basically, your body is divided up into all these parts. So there's a division for your heart, a division for your lungs, a division for psychiatry, all these different ones, and each of them have their own advisory committee. Now, what happened about a few months before this FDA advisory committee meeting is that the FDA had realized that a lot of these advisory committee meeting members were not subject matter experts on the specific things coming before them, and that the FDA was proposing to eliminate the voting at the end. That after the advisory committee meets, then they vote on whether the FDA should or should not accept the drug. And so the FDA themselves has been trying to eliminate the voting. And that's being discussed right now, and we'll see how that goes. So the FDA advisory committee are appointees by the FDA. So when it's the division of psychiatry, they're supposedly having a wide range of experience in psychiatry, but they don't need to have special expertise in psychedelics. The Dutch committee, so the other major mistake that I think was made was to think about, in a kind of classic American sense, that all that really mattered was the FDA in the US. So we had started research throughout Europe, in the Netherlands, in Germany, in England, in the Czech Republic, in Norway. We had a whole plan of research moving forward in Europe. And the thing about regulators is that they're cautious a lot of times. And so regulators in one country, look, what have regulators in other countries done? And if you have like this growing sense that multiple countries are moving forward with psychedelic research, it gives each regulator more comfort in going further. So one of the things to save money and to put more money into commercialization, again, assuming this was going to work, Lycos shut down all the international projects, and it became just U.S. focused. All right, so what had happened is that a bunch of the core research had been done in the Netherlands, and so the Dutch government set up their own committee, the Dutch State Committee on MDMA, that was their equivalent of the FDA Advisory Committee, except for the fact that they chose people that knew about psychedelics and that knew about PTSD. So these were real subject matter experts. Not only that, but they gave them about a year to study the literature, and then they ended up publishing a book, like hundreds of pages, about why they came to their conclusions, and their conclusions were the exact opposite of the FDA Advisory Committee. And the Advisory Committee meeting came out on June 4th, and the Dutch committee came out on June 6th, just 2 days later. And there's a lot of people that have not heard about this Dutch committee. For whatever reason, Lykos decided not to promote it. And I think it was like, oh, those Dutch people are smoking pot, and they have the legalized marijuana. For whatever reason, Lykos thought that this is not something that would help, but I think it will. All right, so what the Dutch committee said was that efficacy was proven, safety was proven, and that there's no company trying to make MDMA into a medicine in Europe, and therefore, because there's a major unmet medical need, and because this MDMA-assisted therapy is proven safe and efficacious, that the Dutch government should immediately start what they call naturalistic studies. And what that means is more like real-life work, so that you treat people, there's no control group, you do some basic measurements of safety and efficacy beforehand and after, and that's it. So now there's a whole group of researchers in Europe, in England and Germany and the Netherlands, none yet in Estonia, but we can try to work on that, that feel that they have seen how effective MDMA-assisted therapy works, and they don't want to wait however many years, if ever, for Lykos to go to Europe, because it looks like it's going to be delayed 3 years or so in the US. So there's a new nonprofit that's being started in Europe called MDMA Europe. And what it's going to do is negotiate with the EMA, the European Medicines Agency, and also with the MHRA, which is the British equivalent of the FDA. And what they're going to start by saying is, the Dutch government wants these naturalistic studies. Would you find a way, is there a way, if we get 150 people treated in these naturalistic studies, can we bundle all the data together and consider it to be one phase 3 study, and would that be sufficient for you to think about it for approval? So that's going to take the next couple months or so to get this nonprofit really formed and to start this conversation. But I think what you can do in Estonia is to sort of speak that the FDA didn't decide that MDMA was too risky. They didn't decide that MDMA-assisted therapy didn't work. They just said that they weren't persuaded by the studies, because they backtracked on our agreement and said, oh, we didn't like this idea that it was an inactive placebo, which is outrageous for them to be able to do that. But they said, we want another phase 3 study. So the FDA is saying we want more research. And there's research going on in the VA, the Veterans Administration. 7 different VAs or so are having studies and more. And there's research now moving way forward in Israel and in Australia. They've approved compassionate use of MDMA and psilocybin. Canada has as well. And so I think you could say fully, honestly and transparently that we need more research, and that would be the way to start in Estonia, would be some sort of research study. Now, what we say is that the therapist should have special training in how, what the therapy is that we think is optimized for MDMA for PTSD. So it's not MDMA mixed with these other things, it's this thing we call inner-directed therapy. So M.A.P.S is now moving to do international trainings all over the world, and we've just done one recently, well, it was the second one in Sarajevo, and so now there's a project that's being in the development stage with therapists that we've partially trained to work with survivors of the Srebrenica massacre from 30 years ago, where about 8,000 Muslim men and boys were killed, and so this will be for the women survivors of that. There's a project in Denmark that's going to be for Syrian refugees who are in Denmark, were given citizenship and are covered by national health insurance. There's projects that we are working on in Rwanda, where we just shipped 2.1 grams of MDMA to Rwanda for a protocol for therapists to receive MDMA as part of their training. Because these are people that don't have a psychedelic culture, they've never done psychedelics, and the idea that they would then sit for other people without really knowing what it does in themselves isn't the way to get the best results. And what we've already heard, about 4 people in Somaliland have received MDMA therapists. One of them had decades of certain kind of pain, abdominal pain, gone away. MDMA now does a lot of psychosomatic healing as well. So it seems like it works cross-culturally. And we're about to do a training in Australia, and then we're talking about, we'll do one inside Ukraine. So I don't know, by the way, if you've seen the Ukrainian art exhibit, I'm Fine, which is just incredible. You know, it's made out of signs with bullet holes and artillery shells in it. And they would, Ukrainians after attacks would text each other, if they're still alive, I'm fine. So we do want to do this. So we can take therapists from Estonia, if there are therapists that want to be trained, into the Ukrainian project, into the Australia project. So the Australia one is going to be in November. So there is a cost to it. In certain places we have raised money to subsidize it. So the Ukrainian training will be free to Ukrainians. In the Sarajevo training, it was free to about half the people. We also brought in about 15 Arabic-speaking people. So we're doing a lot of work in Israel, but we're also wanting to do work with Palestinians and in the Arab region. Natalie Ginsburg, who's on M.A.P.S.'s staff, has actually helped start the Arab Psychedelic Society. And there's actually a camp here, some of you may have heard about, called Cosmic Camels. And it's about people from throughout the Arab region in Israel camping together. So, and there has been small numbers of people, Arabs and Israelis, doing ayahuasca and MDMA together. And then there's starting to look at psychedelics for conflict transformation. But it's gonna, maybe we could find donations, but if you could find therapists in Estonia that were interested, it's a 6-day program. I mean, it's a long way to get to Australia, but you know, the Ukrainian one. So anyway, that I think would be the way to start. To say to your government that we want to do research, we want to work with trained therapists. The MDMA could come from Canadian manufacturers, and there's 3 parts of the training. The first part is the 6-day program. We've done it during the pandemic online, but the trainers didn't think it worked as well. It's really important for people to be together, to be at like a retreat center, and then to talk about their issues. A lot of it is watching videotapes of therapy sessions, doing role play, things like that. And then the next step is for people for us to try to arrange for people to have their own MDMA experience. So we will never require it, but it's strongly encouraged. And that's difficult to get permission for. There's loads of places, if you're a psilocybin therapist, you can go to Jamaica, or you can go to the Netherlands, or you can go to Costa Rica, or all sorts of, there are other places you can go to have legal psilocybin experiences. Oregon is one now with the Oregon Psilocybin Initiative. Colorado will be happening. But there's nowhere in the world you can go for a legal MDMA experience unless it's part of a protocol. Because when people think about drug policy reform, the easier wins are with plants. People think, oh, plants, you know, they're benign, they're okay. Why should plants be illegal? What we're trying to tell people is that MDMA really does come from a plant also, just happens to be a manufacturing plant. And then there are, he's here actually, Ford Smith has a facility to, I'll get to in just a second, he has a facility to produce pharmaceutical drugs, and the thought was if they start with sassafras, or where you get saffron oil, you know, right now the manufacturer for Lycos starts with petroleum, and you get all the organic molecules and you mix them together, and eventually you get MDMA. But then this is just like a marketing thing. If you could start with sassafras and you say, oh, it's plant-based or something, or then people think, oh, it's from a plant.
Do you know the psilocin derivative that's being worked with now that's not illegal because it's not like psilocybin? Do you know what I'm referring to? I'm sorry, I don't know the name of
Was,
it.
was it supposedly mixed with the toad, with the 5-MeO and psilocybin together?
I think so. I feel like there's a number 5 in the name. Like
Oh, okay,
something
yeah,
5.
that's a big controversy right now because people have had some analyzed, and from what I understand, it just was psilocybin. And there's litigation going on and all of this, but there's a whole lot of marketing. I ran into somebody yesterday, no, 2 days ago, and she wanted to thank me. She said she just had a tremendously healing experience with MDMA. It was super pure, it was great, and the dealer sold it to her and said it was M.A.P.S. MDMA. And she had a wonderful experience. And I said, I hate to tell you this, but you've been lied to. You know, the MDMA that M.A.P.S. has is DEA licensed, it's super controlled, there's no leakage. And in fact, in 1985, before I started M.A.P.S., I knew that I needed a supply of MDMA. So I worked with Dave Nichols, who worked closely with Sasha Shogun, and he was at Purdue, and I had him make a kilogram, 1,000 grams of MDMA for $4,000, $4 a gram. And it was super pure, it was the best MDMA in the world, and he also got a great yield, so he got 1.5 kilograms of MDMA. Best in the world. And the reason I'm saying this is I've never done it, because I've not taken the legal MDMA. Fortunately, I have good sources for the illegal MDMA. But anyway, there's a lot of marketing. So this was like M.A.P.S. MDMA. One of the things, just to say, you know that we have the Zendo here for psychedelic harm reduction. And Burning Man is increasingly getting more and more supportive of psychedelic harm reduction, of peer support. But the next step, which has been done at Boom Festival in Portugal, which is the leading example of a psychedelic-friendly festival. It's again camping out for about 5-6 days, but they have thin layer chromatography on site where you can get your drugs analyzed. And not only do you get your drugs analyzed, but they post flyers all over the festival what these drugs are supposedly claimed to be and what they actually are. So that's the next big step for Burning Man and for psychedelic harm reduction, is to have drug checking. But we're a step away from that. All right, so what has been, oh yeah, go ahead.
I want to get back to your recommendation about coming out, you know, and you mentioned the potential effect on your reputation, but I'd like to ask a little bit about what are the potential legal consequences of being outspoken that you do MDMA therapy, either for a licensed therapist, or a lot of people lead MDMA experiences who are not licensed therapists. What are the legal consequences of saying that publicly?
Okay, so thank you for asking that question. The situation in America with the laws is that you cannot testify against yourself. You have a First Amendment right. You know, you plead the Fifth Amendment. You cannot testify against yourself. So if you were to say, I am someone who had whatever issues, and I went to an underground psychedelic therapist, and now I feel way better, and you want to speak about it in public, you have zero legal risk. Because there's no proof, it's what you said, but if it ever gets to a court, you could say, oh, I was just making it up, or there's no evidence at all. Also, the background factor people need to keep in mind is that last year, about 110,000 people died from opiate overdoses and fentanyl overdoses. That's been the case for the last bunch of years. So the police, if they were to go, now also look at psychedelic churches. One of the things that's been a really amazing development is the psychedelic churches. So yesterday, a friend of mine who's here at Burning Man started the Church of Ambrosia. I don't know if you've heard of this church, but it's a mushroom church. They have 100,000 members, and they give them mushrooms. You just have to be, oh, here, I want to be part of this church. So they're distributing enormous amounts of mushrooms through this religious context. Now, David Hodges, who's the guy, he's ready to go to jail. He doesn't want to, but he's got lawyers and everything. So first, I have to keep in mind now, there's all these psychedelic churches. There's a few of them starting to say that MDMA is a sacrament. It doesn't have to be a plant. So that's really good. Now, there's no legal risk. So if you are a therapist then, and you say, I have done illegal underground work with people and I've found it to be really effective, you're not going to have a legal risk, but you could have a risk with your license. So that's where this reputational situation is more of concern. If you could be called before a licensing board and say, hey, you're doing illegal stuff and these drugs are not approved. So it's more risky for therapists or psychiatrists to say, I work with this in my practice, than it is for a patient to say, this helped me.
So you've just, thank you, can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah, sure.
You've given, actually, I've heard you give two examples. Somebody goes to an underground situation, has an experience, no legal risk, right? I've heard you say a licensed therapist might go before the court. What about an unlicensed therapist, which is a lot of people, facilitating? If you, let's say you have a website, and you say on your website, come to me and I will guide you through MDMA, what is the legal risk of that kind of exposure? Because I'm thinking about what you've said, like the more people come out, the better.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So there are a lot of people who do this, but they don't publicly acknowledge this what they're doing. And I'm wondering how, what would be the legal consequence to everybody who does it saying this is what I do?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that makes me really happy every day I wake up that I'm not in jail, I think really good. So I have also worked with really good lawyers to address some of these exact same questions. So the thing is that if you say, I do psychedelic therapy, I don't have a license, and I work with these different drugs and I find them to be very effective, again, there's nothing can be done. If you say, I have an office over here and every Friday I do psychedelic therapy, if the police have time and space information about something that's illegal, then they can get a search warrant, then they can come. So if you stay vague, like, in general I do this, I don't do this, you don't say I do it at my office or I do it in nature, so I think you can stand up and say, I have been sitting for people and I see this is very, very effective. You still have reputational risk. Depends on if you're in a small town. It could be the police say, hey, we want to watch this guy. But they tend not to do that because that is not really the kind of things that come to the surface for them to deal with. Now, the next step is when do underground therapists get in trouble? So most people would think that an underground therapist, the way they most likely get in trouble is that they do work with someone and the therapy doesn't work well and the patient is upset and they're left in a frightening state or whatever, and then they blame the therapist or they say, my problem is because you didn't say this or that at the right time, and then they call the authorities. That's what you would normally think why underground therapists get in trouble when the therapy doesn't go well, but that is not what happens. The problem is when therapy goes well and then somebody says, and this I'll give you two specific instances. It's when somebody says, this therapy really helped me a lot, and now I'm ready to make some changes in my life. I want to leave this religious community that I'm part of that's a bit fundamentalist. And so this is one exact case where the people left behind call the police and call the FDA and complain to the licensing board. So if you're an underground therapist, to really be fully protected, you need to understand not just who you're working with, but what is their community, what is their family. Other situation that occurred in Europe where someone got divorced and the people that was left behind said, I didn't like this, and then they complained. That was a little bit more complicated because the person that broke up then started an affair with, or started a relationship with somebody else in this psychedelic community. The person left behind was really pissed off. So I think that there's also strength in numbers. So the more people that come out and say, I've found these to be effective. There's also, how much do you want to push it? So like the Church of Ambrosia, there are people that, like David Hutchins, is pushing this limit. So there's something to be said. So yesterday at one of my talks, there was this woman saying that she was wondering about underground psychedelic therapy. She was really ready to do work above ground if FDA approved MDMA. Now it's going to be years. She's wondering about doing underground therapy. And so what I told her is that this is certainly it's a risk, but that if the police of any size, of any jurisdiction would go after you for doing underground therapy that turned out well, if there's no malpractice or anything like that, that you would make a tremendous test case and we would provide you with free lawyers. So there's the Psychedelic Bar Association that has been set up to provide lawyers for people, therapists that get in trouble or for other kind of situations. So everybody has to make, one of the other parts of anonymity, this is kind of a funny story, is that there was this one couple that I met here at Burning Man. I'd only met them at Burning Man, and they were from a very wealthy family, and they started making these donations, and they said that they wanted them to be anonymous. And one of the reasons was that their foundation had a particular mission, and they said coloring outside of the lines. And so if that got known, then people might think they'd fund anything, and so they didn't want that. But the other main reason they said is that they were getting money from the guy's father every year for the foundation, and they just wasn't sure if he was comfortable with psychedelics, so they wanted it to be anonymous from the guy's father. And after 7 years, things changed, society changed, and they said I could talk about it now. So that was Peter and Jennifer Buffett, Warren Buffett's son. And then the other one that was hilarious for me was this fella that made some large donations to M.A.P.S, and he said they wanted it to be anonymous. And I said, well, we're trying to build credibility. If you can be acknowledged by your name, it will destigmatize it, it will give other people courage. And he said, no, it had to be anonymous, and he explained it was because he wanted to hide it from his wife. He said his wife cared about money more than he did, and if she knew how much money he was giving away, she would be upset. and therefore it had to be anonymous. So I'll also just add one other thing about Jewish law, which is that in philanthropy, the highest form of philanthropy is to do it anonymously, where you're not doing it for your own ego gratification. And so I'm from a Reformed Jewish tradition, so I have modified Jewish law and updated it and improved it. So the highest form of philanthropy now is if you are giving to a controversial cause and you're willing to donate in a method for attribution, where you are now donating your money and your reputation, and you're standing up, not for your ego, but because you think that would destigmatize it, that's an even higher form of charity. So I've applied that logic to a bunch of donors, and some of them would switch from being anonymous to being identified. Yeah, that's about the only Jewish law I've actually updated and changed. But I think that the point, or what you're trying to say is how do people come out and how do you do it in a safe way? And I would say that the most important thing is with your immediate family members and people that you know that will believe you and that trust you and that might change their mind. But then also in these more public forums, that can be really good. And the other thing is that there is this, I tried to teach this to my children and to others, is that there's the law over here, and then there's the enforcement of the law. And there's an enormous amount of space between the law and the enforcement of the law. And a lot of that is gray areas, that's where you're taking risks, but there's a lot of room to maneuver in this place where you're over the line of what's legal or illegal, and I just call on everybody to realize that you need your own moral compass. You cannot rely on what's legal. Slavery was legal. The Holocaust was legal. So it's really what's moral, what's your own moral compass, and then that'll help guide you where you want to be if you're over this line of what's legal, before you can get into it.
Yeah, Rick, I help employers who have self-funded health programs run their self-funded health programs. So it's not like the traditional get approved by insurance, Cigna, United, Healthcare, all of these guys. I wonder what type of fringe billing codes I can help point people to. I wonder what, I see people who could be, referred to maybe studies in the health plans. I don't know, how would people go about maybe getting more access to fringe care or recruited for these studies?
Okay, so there's a website called clinicaltrials.gov. Now, it used to be, up until I think 10 or 15 years ago, I'm not sure exactly when, but that you have to have 2 successful phase 3 studies to get the FDA to approve a medicine. And what pharma companies would do is they would do many, many, many of these, and loads of them would not work. And the ones that would not work, you'd never hear of. And the ones that worked, they would publish in a scientific journal. So there could be like 7 failed studies, 2 successful studies, the 2 ones you hear about, the 7 you never hear about. And that became increasingly problematic. And so then the law was set up so that on clinicaltrials.gov you must list your protocols, so that you cannot disappear unsuccessful protocols anymore. The pharma industry can no longer do that. But if you go to clinicaltrials.gov, you can search for all the clinical trials. So you can put in psilocybin and you'll see all the psilocybin studies. Or you can put in PTSD and you'll see all the PTSD. Or you can put in PTSD and psilocybin and you'll see all the ones just there. Or you can even put in cities or states or countries. So clinicaltrials.gov is the way for people to understand, are there any studies for which they could volunteer? Now, as far as this insurance coverage, there's a group called M.A.P.S, which is trying to work in this area, and their first area of focus is companies that self-insure. So if you go to Walmart or you go to Apple or you go to Amazon, these are such enormous companies that they don't have insurance. They just pay out of pocket and they find it's less expensive. But they also are very interested in trying to, do the best for their employees. And so these will be the first adopters a lot of times, not through the insurance companies, but through companies that self-insure. Yeah, N-THEA, E-N-T-H-E-A. Yeah, that's really good. So eventually, of course, we do want the insurance companies to cover it. And yeah, and I think that they will, but we've got to, first off, that's one of the main reasons. So I guess what I want to share is that even though this FDA strategy has crashed and burned, and they have to do another phase 3 study, the FDA approach is critically important. We really need to go through the FDA. That's how you build credibility. That's how you get insurance coverage. The FDA approves it. You can do work in Estonia. You can do work all over the place. Many countries, of course, don't have this. The FDA is the most sophisticated regulatory agency in the world, even more than the EMA. And so many countries will just say, if the FDA approved it, we'll accept it. It's also the way to build support in the U.S. And the other part of my message is that I believe the Lykos will succeed. I think that it's going to take them about 3 years. They're going to negotiate something or other with the FDA, some new phase 3 design, and I think that it will work. And I think that they'll be able to raise the money. So I think that this delay is temporary, and it was terribly depressing that the hundreds of millions of investor money was lost in the valuation of Lykos. It'll be 3 years or so, but the real losers are not the investors, although they lost a bunch. The real losers are the patients who are not able to access this. And there's 5,000-6,000 vets commit suicide every year or more, and way more other people commit suicide, and there's a lot of people that could be helped. So I think this gets into the importance, in a way, for people to think about underground therapy. So one of the most unintended consequences of the FDA rejection is going to be fueling the underground therapy movement, and more people are going to go seek that out. And some of the underground therapists are tremendously skilled, and a lot of them are tremendously courageous, and some of them have licenses that they're putting at risk as well. So I think the real heroes of this movement are the underground therapists that are willing to help people even though they're putting their license at risk. And often the underground therapists are ahead of what's going on in the research. So in the research, we can only study one drug at a time. So underground therapists have learned, you give LSD and then a couple hours later you give MDMA, or you combine it with massage, or you do different kind of things. So a lot of times the underground therapists are actually ahead of what's going on above ground in the science area. So, yes.
Yeah, I had some quick questions for you. Thanks for all the work you've been doing on this, by the way. The thing that I've heard about the studies that were rejected is that a lot of the patients had actually used MDMA before. Is that true?
Yeah, it's true. But is that a problem? All right, so in phase 2, 30% of the people who volunteered for phase 2 had done prior experience with MDMA. So when we negotiated phase 3, the FDA did not say, don't enroll people who've done MDMA before. So there was an agreement that we could enroll people with prior experience with MDMA. It was part of the inclusion-exclusion criteria. We didn't want people that had done it more than 5 or 6 times, so they've done it a few times. So the first thing to say is they still have PTSD, right? It's not in the drug. These people have done the drug, they still have PTSD. The claim was that now these people are the ones that like MDMA. You know, they've done MDMA before, they like it, and so now that they're volunteering for the study, they're going to have fewer side effects, and they're more likely to get better because they're coming in biased in favor of MDMA. So if you look at the 60% of the people that had never done MDMA before, compared to the 40%, there's no difference in safety or efficacy. So the theory that these people with prior experience with MDMA somehow or other bias the results is not borne out by the data. But it's something that you could say, oh, this is our worries, and then that becomes a big thing. The other part is that this idea that the therapists were biased because they themselves had done MDMA. Because that was a big part of our training of therapists, is to give them MDMA. So there was an article last Sunday's New York Times, and it was about, oh, what went wrong? And one of the sort of article titles was, they got high on their own supply. Basically going after therapists for doing MDMA because now they're biased. So it's obvious to anybody that's ever talked about doing ayahuasca that you would not do ayahuasca with an ayahuasca shaman that had never done ayahuasca themselves. You wouldn't take flying lessons from somebody that never flew a plane. So this idea that they're biased because they, and then they would get into this expectancy, you know, that people have heard about MDMA, heard about how it works, and then because the double blind doesn't work, they have expectations that it's going to work well, and that's somehow biasing the results. But think about this, is that after a drug is approved by the FDA, there's even greater expectancy that it's going to work. Because now you've got the FDA saying it's proven safe and effective instead of just, here's some studies and we hear in the media. So I think that was a false critique that sounds like it's scientific, but when you look at it closer, it really isn't.
I have another question. Is there a reason you couldn't add like a third study group that would take something similar, like amphetamine, like Adderall or something that has been approved for, by the FDA, but at least you have kind of more, like, you're not seeing a placebo effect of a sugar pill. You're actually getting, the amphetamine effect, but not the MDMA effect. Could that be, part of your new study that I assume you have to design now?
Well, it could be, but then what problem is that solving? So this idea of giving, let's say, Ritalin or something. So if you're an experienced MDMA therapist, and these will be experienced therapists, you can tell the difference between Ritalin and MDMA. Is it going to really fool the therapist? You might fool some of the patients who've never done anything like that, but you're not going to fool the therapists. So it's not really double blind. Double blind is both, patients and therapists. Then the other thing is, if you look at people who have PTSD, what do they self-medicate with? Alcohol, marijuana, tranquilizers. People with PTSD don't self-medicate with stimulants. It makes them more vulnerable in those. So there's that whole ethical question. And then, what did I describe before about the low dose of MDMA, where the lower doses of MDMA are more like stimulants without as much of the empathic qualities. So it's not that difficult. So, but then the other part is that we negotiated with FDA the two groups. So whether you want another group, now there is some studies that are being done inside, I think it's the West LA VA, where they are using amphetamine as an active control to try to sort out how much of this is to amphetamines, how much of it is for the additional benefit you get from MDMA. So yeah, you could do studies like that, and I'm certain that the group that gets MDMA would do better than the group that gets amphetamine. by itself.
Okay, 2 more really quick questions. Is MDMA patented or patentable?
MDMA was invented by Merck in 1912, and they patented it. And then in 1927, they did a bunch of studies in animals, and they looked at the results, and they said there's nothing interesting here. And so the patent has been now in the public domain. Merck also did studies in 1959, again in animals, again found nothing. So the molecule is in the public domain. Then I started M.A.P.S, then there's use patents. There's other kind of patents that you can get, not on the molecule, not on composition of matter, but on the uses. So I started M.A.P.S in 1986. Another group started to develop Ibogaine in 1986. Howard Lotsoff, it was called NDA International, and they got use patents on Ibogaine for opiate addiction and substance use disorder. They tried to get investors, and within a few years, what they had is scientists and investors are all suing each other over patent rights. And it destroyed Ibogaine for decades and decades until the patents expired. So I went to the attorney that developed the use patent on Ibogaine, and I said, I want you to help me develop an anti-patent strategy so nobody can patent the uses of MDMA. And what they said is that to patent something, you have to be the original inventor. And so if we could collect stories from people that said, I took MDMA and my rheumatoid arthritis went away, or my postpartum depression went away, or my social anxiety went away, or all these different kind of things. We collect all these stories, we put them on our website, and now nobody can patent the uses for those things, because they didn't invent the idea of it. What I was not smart enough to realize, and I didn't really study patents, is that pharma companies get patents on the manufacturing process. So once you knock out use patents, you knock out composition of matter patents, and this started with Compass Pathways, where the psilocybin group, where they wanted to patent, and they have patents, on what they call the polymorph form of the psilocybin crystal. Of certain forms, they've patented those, and they want to try to use that to block everybody else who would use psilocybin, maybe with those polymorph forms, or maybe with not, but they want to use that. Now, the patent system is twisted in a bunch of different ways, and pharma companies have learned how to manipulate it. But if you are a innovator company, and you have, let's say you have a patent on something, but you have multiple patents, your first one is running out, a generic manufacturer wants to enter the market, if you sue them for infringing on your patent, your new patent, the FDA automatically is blocked for 2.5 years from issuing a license to the generic while you litigate in court whether it infringes or not. In Australia, if you are a generic company and you're sued and you win the case, you don't infringe, not only do they have to pay your lawyer's fees, but they have to, the innovator company has to pay all these fines for the money that they made when the drug should have been generic. But there's nothing like that in the US. So there is this situation where if you're a generic company and you have not been sued in 45 days, you can go to the courts and you ask for a summary judgment to say, the courts say, we will make it so you can never be sued. But the condition is you have to make your entire package to the FDA available to the innovator company for them to examine to see if there is any evidence that there is infringement on their patent. So what I suggested at a Lykos board meeting is that since it's a public benefit company, it should make a good faith effort during these 45 days to see if somebody infringes before you sue them. And unfortunately, because I believe that I failed at raising all the money we need from donors, we had to take in investors, and then you have obligations to the investors, and so that was voted down, that they will not make a good faith effort to see if somebody infringes, because it could be $1 billion of revenue that you're voluntarily giving away, but that's pharma tricks, how they gain the system, and that's why people don't like pharma. So there are, now what Lykos is doing, and they've made this public, is they're trying to patent the particle size for the machines that put the MDMA in the capsules. And that's what they want to use to block generics for 20 years. It's just that these high throughput machines that make loads and loads of capsules, that it's novel in the sense that nobody's ever done that. Nobody has ever tried to make large amounts of MDMA and stick it through these machines and put it into capsules. So it is novel. Whether it's going to be enough to block other people is a big question. But yeah, so M.A.P.S had an anti-patent strategy. I didn't realize that you would be able to make these patents on the manufacturing process and then use that to block generics. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi Rick, my name is Allie. Thank you for being with us. From everything that you said, it's sounding like there's nothing really maybe the attorneys can do. We just have to move towards phase 3. Is that absolutely correct? Or?
Well, it's not absolutely correct. So last Friday, so when you get something from the FDA, there are layers of ways that you can object. So the first thing is you object and you ask for what's called a Type A meeting, and you meet with the people at the division that rejected what you wanted to do, and you go over it with them, and then we've now done that twice. So there was one protocol that the FDA rejected years ago, and this was to give MDMA to therapists as part of their training. We got one of those years ago, and we had 125 therapists get MDMA as part of their training. That's why I think we had such good results, in part, in phase 3. But then new people at the FDA were in charge of the Division of Psychiatry. They said, our second protocol, we won't approve it. And not only that, but your people are not qualified. The lead person needs to be MD PhD, not just licensed as a therapist. And the doctor needs to be on site, not on call. And we said, here's our data. Look at all of our data. The sites that had doctor on call, no more risky adverse events than doctor on site. The teams that had MD PhD, no better results than the teams that had master's therapy. And the FDA just kept rejecting this in these Type A meetings. So then you go to what's called a formal dispute resolution request. And so we did that in that case, and then we completely won, and the senior management reversed everything. Last Friday, we filed a formal dispute with the FDA, not about the MDMA project, but about our marijuana project. So we have a $12.9 million grant from the state of Michigan to study cannabis in 320 veterans with PTSD. And cannabis for PTSD is palliative. It's like an SSRI. It's not curative. You need it every day, but it helps with sleep and nightmares and focuses people on the present. So it's not our preferred approach, but it's valid, and a lot of people use cannabis for PTSD, and they don't have it covered by insurance, only if we get it through the FDA. So the FDA is now refusing to let us study smoked marijuana or study vaporized marijuana. And their arguments don't make scientific sense. They're kind of insinuating that marijuana causes lung cancer, which we know it doesn't, and so does the National Institute on Drug Abuse know it doesn't. And the FDA didn't actually say that, but they misquoted somebody. Anyway, and then for vaporization, where we're talking about the packs, if you know the packs, vaporizer, you put a bud in it, it heats it up, you get a steam. They were like, oh, these isolated cannabinoids in vape pens with different oils, they have safety risks, and we're against that. We're like, fine, but that's not what we're doing. So now we've launched this formal dispute, and our lawyers are saying they think we'll win. So from the Lykos perspective, they're going to start with this Type A meeting. That'll take another couple months, and then they'll see what they come out with at the end, and then they'll decide whether they want to do the formal dispute, which could delay another 4 or 5 months, or whether they want to go ahead and just accept what FDA says. But either way, I think that therapy, it's going to be about 3 years, my guess, before it becomes a medicine.
Yeah, I did the M.A.P.S MDMA training, and it was incredible. So really, really, really excited for that. Also, we'd love to do a little plug for you for Psychedelic Science 2025. The last one was amazing. And also, loved Prescription X, all the previews. I know it has a name change, but I want to plug that for you too. And
Like I don't know.
Is it no longer coming out soon?
Okay, so there's been a documentary, now it's called What a Trip. Thank you. So this has been, I've for a long time wanted to tell the real story of how M.A.P.S worked through all of this, but some of it is above ground, some of it is underground. And so Nirvan Mullick, who I've known from college days, so he's been following me for 10 years, doing a documentary about the real background stuff. One of the more interesting points was underground therapy that I would do here at Burning Man. And I was at Burners Without Borders, and this guy comes up to me, and he's in his 60s. He's totally crying. He's like, I'm ready. You know, he said, I was ready to commit suicide. I was planning to do that. I was in the medical tent getting something patched up, and somebody said, oh, there's a talk about something new for PTSD. And he came and checked us out. And then he said not only was he a veteran, but he was also a police officer. And I thought, you are perfect. This is the exact kind of people we want to help. I was there with a doctor, and we talked to him about it, and we ended up deciding to do work with him, which was very helpful. And so that part is part of this documentary, but it's sort of me doing underground illegal psychedelic therapy, which I don't think if it's in the movie, nothing will happen to me, you know, but it's something that would piss off the FDA, stuff like that. So there's a bunch of stuff like that we thought would come out after FDA approval. So Nirvan he's working on it for 10 years. He's ready for this to be done. And now he's trying to think it out, you know, what to do now. And I said, there is kind of a good thing. Now, as I said, we're at the stage we are burnt to a crisp. We have been, you know, demonized. We've been, you know, I'm leader of a therapy cult, all this stuff. The FDA has squashed us, hundreds of millions of. We're just like at the low point. I said, that might be a good place to end this. You know, and then if there's a part 2 where we, you know, come back from the dead and, you know, make it into a medicine. So Nirvan is not sure what he wants to do. But I think you can see what a trip. I think there's a trailer.
And they're taking donations. Hey.
Yes. Yeah, and Psychedelic Science 2025 is, I think, the 16th to the 20th in June. Last time we had 12,400 people. This time we hope for it to be even more. And it's going to be the whole field. It's going to be tremendous. And we'd like to, you know, invite all of you to come to that. And I think that there's, it's a temporary setback. You know, I think it's harder for people like yourself to think, you've got patients, you know this could help, you've been through training, what do you do? One thing to think about is research. You know, there is ways to continue doing different kinds of research. But again, who's going to pay for it? What's it for? So the main area of research that M.A.P.S is going to do, what is Lykos not going to do? Lykos is going to focus on the U.S. They're not going to focus on Europe and the rest of the world. So M.A.P.S is going to do international therapist trainings, and we're going to do humanitarian projects all over the world where people have trauma, where there's not a lot of resources. And there are, one of the best uses of MDMA in my life, and many people will say this, is couples therapy. MDMA is great to do with your partner. It's really helps you to be a better listener, helps you to speak more honestly, helps you be less defensive. You're filled with kind of self-compassion. It's tremendous. But couples therapy is not a diagnosis. It's not, you know, DSM. I mean, it can feel like that if you're in a difficult relationship or difficult spot, but it's not clear that FDA could approve MDMA for couples therapy. There's actually nothing in the law that prevents them from approving something that's not a diagnosable disorder. So it's potential. So the lawyer that we're working with that won this formal dispute on the therapy protocol to give therapists MDMA, that we're working with now on the marijuana project, she's near the end of her career. And she said she would love to take on this case of whether to force the FDA, if we got good data from MDMA for couples therapy, to, you know, challenge them when they say, oh, they can't approve it for that. So that's the kind of thing that M.A.P.S is doing, is the things that Lykos is not going to do. And there'll be all sorts of discussions about things. And what we're going to try to do at Psychedelic 2025 that we didn't do before is because Colorado passed the natural plant initiative. And so we want to have experiential opportunities for people. And this is why.
That's how we met, by the way.
What?
Wait, that's how we met at the one last year. They did the, you know, Randy's
Yeah, yes.
thing.
Oh, you did that?
And we were supposed to do the one with you, but then
Yeah.
it got canceled.
Yeah.
So that was really cool.
Oh. Yeah, we want to have all sorts of things with ayahuasca churches and mushrooms and peyote before and after the conference. So people can have experiences, then they can think about it for a while. We didn't do that before because we were, you know, too tied in with Lykos, and they didn't like that idea. And we had, you know, so I think it'll be a different kind of an experience, more like Burning Man, more like experiences and lectures.
Thank you, Rick.
Yeah. Thank you for the advice. All right. Anybody else have any questions at the moment? Yeah.
Thanks. Hi, Rick. It's Dana. I am curious about ongoing training for the people who have already went through the MDMA training and what that might look like for like follow-ups.
Okay, so as I said, there's 3 parts of the training. You're talking about people that have been through the first part. There are several thousand people that have now been through it, either online or in person. About 800 of them were online. Again, our therapists didn't particularly like the online version. The next part is something that, in this logical sequence, would be opportunities for therapists to be a patient themselves, to take MDMA in a therapeutic setting. Lycos doesn't want to have anything to do with that. They think that's too controversial, and so there are basically no opportunities. We're trying to work in Canada to see if we can get a protocol approved. I've been searching the world for places where there can be a way where somebody could go to get MDMA as part of their training. For a while it looked like St. Vincent's and the Grenadines might be one. We're going to try with various people in Jamaica if we can get permission, in Canada. We got permission in Bahamas. I even had a meeting with the Prime Minister of the Bahamas, but then the company wasn't able to raise enough money even though we had the protocol approved. So Lycos has no plans to do the second part. Then the third part is where people actually work with a PTSD patient, and it's videotaped and it's supervised with adherence rates. So that only happens in a legal context. So that's not happening either. So unfortunately, there's really no opportunities for further training from, Lycos or from M.A.P.S, since you've already been through the first part. But the best training is 2 parts, is your own experiences, and also sitting with people if you're comfortable doing that. And then also the thing that I worry about a lot, and I think the FDA decision makes these worries greater, is that the field of the for-profit psychedelic field is getting the idea that the therapy is a complicating factor and that they should eliminate the therapy. So I don't know if you've seen this, but the most bogus press release that boosted their stock was Mind Medicine, and they talked about how they did an LSD study for, I think it was generalized anxiety disorder, and they did it completely without therapy. And what that implies to people is, oh, this can be a take-home drug. You can do, well, it turned out they had therapists and psychiatrists with people the entire time. They just told them, don't do therapy. But they're providing psychological support. So there's active efforts to have people in the room, but to constrain what they can do so that it's not called therapy, so it's easier for the FDA to approve it. So I worry about this, how do you get further training? I think that the field is moving away from that in a way that it's not about what's best for patients. Best for patients is therapists getting more training. So M.A.P.S is going to try to do what we can with this model of therapists having their own experience and then being supervised. But unfortunately, the drift of the sense that people got from watching the advisory committee meeting was, oh, this therapy is a problem. There was an incredible, it was in STAT, it was an op-ed, it was by Tom Insel, who used to be the head of the National Institute of Mental Health. And the point that he was making, this is about a month ago, is that he said the real innovation of Lycos was not working with MDMA. It was the combination of MDMA with therapy, and that's the real innovation. And that when you look at all the data that shows, looking at psychotherapy and pharmacotherapy, when they're combined, it works better than either alone. So if you get SSRIs with therapy, you get ketamine with therapy, when you combine these things, they work better together than alone. And so what Tom was saying in this op-ed was that we have to switch from seeing the therapy as a bug that's a problem for the regulatory system to seeing it as it's the innovative feature that we need to find a way to facilitate. But I think his voice did not carry the day, and that's what I worry about. So I think that working at Zendo is a way to get further experience and training.
Yeah, 6 years on Doe, volunteers now.
Yeah.
Have you thought about working with the state of Colorado to see if they can get it written into their laws?
Yeah, to add MDMA to
Yeah.
Colorado, yes, definitely. Yeah, the problem is that, so the Massachusetts is going to be, the leading drug policy reform initiative with psychedelics is on the ballot in Massachusetts on November, and it's also a series of natural plant psychedelics. And because I'm in Massachusetts and I was like saying, hey, let's add MDMA to this, it turns out that the polling is that when you add synthetics, enough people get nervous that it might not pass. So MDMA is not included. There was an effort in California, in a legislative effort, to add MDMA. And what was really problematic is that we got Lycos to say that it will not interfere with drug policy reform with MDMA. But some of the Lycos investors were nervous about adding MDMA to the California legislative and started, raising some objections. It didn't come out of committee. But yeah, we want, now what I mentioned before is there's some psychedelic churches that are starting to say that MDMA could be a sacrament. And here's an amazing story. One of our fundraisers, who's no longer working for M.A.P.S, but he was very deep in the ayahuasca community. But he's also a therapist and he works with MDMA. So this is just recently, about 6 months ago, he was down in Brazil and he brought MDMA to give to ayahuasca shamans. So he was actually sitting for ayahuasca shamans with MDMA. And he said that they found it useful in different ways than the ayahuasca was. And a few of these small Santo Daime churches were thinking, hey, maybe we should make MDMA a sacrament, as well as with ayahuasca. Now the Santo Daime also makes cannabis. Santa Maria is considered a sacrament. They've had to give that up in the US because that was, they thought, too controversial. So what can we do to bring MDMA forward in whatever ways? Yeah, if we can get it covered in state initiatives, that would be a big, big breakthrough. And there is some thought that California in 2026 could be an effort to do an initiative, not a legislative, but that'll cost like $20 million. But there, when you do an initiative, you control the language and you can add whatever. But then you do the polling, and sometimes it gets taken out. So we need to really help people understand that, at least I believe, that if you have psilocybin from a mushroom or you have psilocybin that's made in a lab, it's exactly the same thing. There's really no difference between something, that LSD is, there's a spirit of LSD the same way there's a spirit of ayahuasca. I personally believe. Yes, there's a spirit of the toad and all of these things. And more of it should be synthetic 5-MeO to preserve the toads, and it'll be the same. Now, I do think there's an entourage effect with cannabis. So if you smoke isolated cannabinoids versus the plant, it's a lot richer and fuller, I think, when you smoke the plant rather than. So I think in that case, there is this other terpenes and other cannabinoids. But my guess is, and nobody studied this, that if you were to study psilocybin extract from a mushroom that has other things that are in the mushroom, and compare it to synthetic psilocybin for depression, I think the results would be the same. Did you have a question, Kate, about how could you do an EMDR MDMA study?
You are
Would you
relentless. I feel like I'm tougher than the FDA here. We can talk later. No, my real question is, I've heard statements recently about being off the Lycos board that you feel unleashed. Do you feel unleashed this week?
Well, I am aware of cameras and of pissing people off. But yeah, I do feel unleashed.
Okay.
And
I unleashed my inner kindergartner and made Rick get unleashed with Doblin shirts.
Oh my gosh, Kate, you're This t-shirt that I'm wearing now is from 2001. This was the first psychedelic harm reduction that we ever did. It was at Hookaville, and it was with M.A.P.S, SSDP, and dancing. And so 2001 is when we started psychedelic harm reduction. 2002 was when we started Boom, and 2003 was when we started here at Burning Man. But I'm going to take this shirt off, and I'm going to put your Rick Unleashed shirt on, which is now too. Okay, that is great. I do feel unleashed. But more importantly than me being unleashed is M.A.P.S being unleashed. Because not only did LICO squash me, but it controlled, however this happened is disastrous, but the nonprofit became controlled by the for-profit, in part because I was on the board of the for-profit. And so M.A.P.S has been silent. So what I think happened was that there was a vacuum of communication. There was an over-reliance on the data, under-reliance on the need to communicate with the culture. And then the nonprofit got squelched by the for-profit. And then in this vacuum was filled with negativity. And when you don't respond, it just grows. So, yeah, I'm unleashed. And I will continue talking to you about EMDR and MDMA. Fantastic.
I don't know if this is a question for you or not, but I have the privilege of getting to be with Sendo this year, and I understand that next year it will look very, very different.
Maybe not, so, okay.
Okay. Is this a spoiler?
No, ask your question. Is that
Well, I mean, I only know what they've
okay.
told me,
Oh,
and I'm wondering if
okay.
you know.
Okay, so what had happened is that, this is a bit of a longer story, but this just goes to show that I had thought that the risk of doing Zendo is that somebody has a medical crisis, and we have people that are treating them for difficult psychedelic experiences, and something goes wrong, and this medical crisis turns into a problem, and then we could be liable because we were treating somebody psychologically when they had a physical problem. So I thought that all of the risk from M.A.P.S, from doing Zendo, when Zendo was just recently its own nonprofit, but the only risk I thought was here at Burning Man, and that's why we tried to have a medical person on every shift, so that we could then, because the Burning Man organization didn't want to put their own medical people, didn't want to cover us under their insurance. We were not able to get insurance for it. So then we had an opportunity to do lightning in a bottle, working under another medical staff. So the Zendo had no medical responsibility. We're just working under somebody else's medical license. And a young woman was brought into the medical, was evaluated by the medical, turned over to Zendo. The Zendo people would call for medical to watch her multiple times. She decompensated. She ended up being taken to the hospital and died. The autopsy said LSD, but people don't die like that from LSD. So what we think probably happened was M.A.P.S, which is a similar drug, but it is caused a lot of fatalities. It's often sold as LSD, but there was no evidence of that. So in any case, the parents of this young woman sued the organization that Lightning in a Bottle. They sued the medical people, and then they sued us. And we had this mediation. We're like, hey, we've got no responsibility. There's not a single piece of paper says we have any medical responsibility. And without our knowledge, the Lightning in a Bottle and the medical team settled for $4 million with the family, but they left M.A.P.S being still able to be sued. They didn't include M.A.P.S in the suit. So the organization that had no medical responsibility was left. And then when you're in a case like this, you're not able to say this family received all this money from these other people. That's not information relevant to the jury. So in any case, we ended up losing, and we had to pay $1 million for something that we had no responsibility. So that's why then we said, okay, M.A.P.S could be a target. If our investment in Lycos turns out to be good, then we will create Zendo as its own organization. And it's mostly funded by M.A.P.S. So what has been happening is that it's difficult to do the fundraising. And so what the thought was by some of the people at Zendo was that this would be, most of the money for Zendo is to do Burning Man. I mean, we have 400 volunteers. It's just, setting up all these facilities, things like that. So the thought was that they would switch. Now this is not my thought, but the thought from Chelsea and others was that next year that they would train people in their camps and not have a central place for that. And that's the story that they wrote that's on the compression ring that's in the temple. So last year, because of the rains, the Zendo space, the Zendo structure took on too much water and it collapsed. And this compression ring, which permitted you to see the sky, it was a beautiful structure. That's now going to be burned up in the temple. And then there's this story about how next year things are going to change. Now, what happened just a couple days ago is Chelsea went to talk to the rangers, and they said, "We need you here. Don't leave." So then Chelsea said, "Well, will you, help us in different ways? Will you store our equipment? Will you do the setup?" Something like that. So now we're negotiating, but I think there's a clear understanding by Chelsea and others that Burning Man has always been nervous because they're on federal land here, and harm reduction is still somewhat risky and dangerous. So that's why the ideal situation should be that when you run a festival like this, you think, "Oh, I gotta have medical here," because people have medical. You should also think, "I gotta have Zendo." It's sort of a core function of the organizers of the festivals, but then you get on liability. So M.A.P.S was willing to take on the liability because I figured that we would be responsible enough that if somebody had a physical problem, we'd refer them to Burning Man Medical. And as it's turned out, since 2003, haven't had a single problem. But at the one place where I thought we had no risk is where we had all the risk. And so I think that who knows how much Burning Man is going to be willing to offer. We all know that there's fewer people here this year than in previous years. And I think that's not so good for Burning Man's finances. But we're asking them to do certain things. But what I've told Chelsea is if there's a distance between what you want and what they're willing to offer, we will go extra on the M.A.P.S side to find new donors to do that. Because I think it's essential that we keep Zendo here and integrate it into increasingly the sort of core functions. And last year we had over 500 people come for help. It's impressive. But this year, I'm not sure what the numbers are. But
We're taking crazy good data, and so I'm wondering, I know that's our internal system, but also does that help, like what you just mentioned, like insurance or getting more permanent spot at Burning Man with support through the org and things like that, anonymized, of course.
well, I think everything will help. I mean, one of the things that was the big difference was about 6 years ago, Sarah Gale, who was the charge of Zendo, was asked to give a presentation to the BLM police here on site. Because for them, they see a bunch of people with difficult trips. They are the rangers are the ones that often find people that are wandering and that are in the midst of a difficult trip and lost their friends and whatever. And it's a problem for the police because if they find people with marijuana, they can give them tickets and they can make money. If they find people with psychedelics, there's no way to give them a ticket that's turned into money. They have to either arrest them or take them off the property, so it's a hassle for them. So Sarah, and they're not really necessarily protecting public safety when you've got people that are either running naked down the road or whatever. I mean, it's just like everybody else. So what they did is that they were then persuaded that when they find people that have difficult trips, they should bring them to Zendo. So now that the federal police bring people to Zendo and know that Zendo is here, the anxiety of the org has gone down. So we'll see what they want to do in terms of finances and support. But either way, there will be Zendo next year. We'll figure it out.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, you have another question? Oh, okay. So this will be near that because it's almost 7:30.
So you had mentioned that there could be a way with doing Zendo that would count for maybe supervision, the third part of the training,
Well,
maybe?
no, it won't count for formal supervision,
Okay.
but it can be still helpful.
Okay.
So it depends. You can. I'm not sure how much they do this at Zendo, but you could have maybe even after Burning Man, you could present difficult cases, or if someone that you sat for was a challenge, so that people can talk with each other about what you might have done or done this or that. But no, because people that come in here, the supervision is for moderate to severe PTSD,
Yeah.
and some of the people that come in probably do have moderate to severe PTSD. But it's also essential for the adherence raters to watch videotapes and then summarize and give to the supervisor. So we're not videotaping anything with the Zendo. So it wouldn't count in a formal way like that.
What if you did it in private practice underground?
Well,
Could you record it and have it?
you could potentially, because the other important thing is that the supervisors and the adherence raters are not employees of Lycos. They're consultants to Lycos.
Okay.
So that's why the core trainers are working with M.A.P.S on these international trainings. If it was Lycos employees, Lycos might block it.
Okay.
But since they're contractors and not employees, so yeah, if you were interested in that, we could talk about which of these supervisors or adherence raters might be willing to do that from something that you video. So keep in mind though that we have 2 cameras ideally. So we have 1 camera on the therapist, 1 camera on the patient, and then because what we're also doing, and this might be something for you to think about, is that these videotapes can also be turned into training videos, so that the trainers train from videos of the patients that they've treated. So when people ask them questions, why did you say this? Why did you say that? Well, they say, look, this is what happened before. This is what we talked about in the prep sessions or anything. So they know. So people want to train with videos that they've made. So it's a little bit trickier, again, when it's underground and illegal for use of training videos, but and you have to have the permission, of course, of the patient. And,
Right.
everybody in it has to give permission, but short of the training, I think we could find ways to get supervisors and their adherence raters to watch.
Okay. Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Great. All right. Well, thank you all. It's been wonderful to hear. And, so you gave great plugs for things. I just want to give a plug for something that's happening at Sunrise tomorrow. So it's the Nova Rave exhibit that's here, and that was there was like 3,500 people on October 7th. Around 359 people were murdered. The attack happened, I think, started at 6:29 in the morning, something like that. So what is happening at the exhibit for the Nova Rave is Roboheart and Mystic Warrior, or Mayan Warrior, are going to be doing a dance set. So there'll be a ceremony at 6, and then dance around 6:29 or something will start. And so just imagine what it would be like to be here at Burning Man and have a bunch of people come in with guns. So what they're saying is that they're resilient, that I'm not sure what the words exactly are, but something like we can dance. What is it? We will dance again. Yeah, so the We Will Dance Again is going to happen tomorrow morning. So for those of you that want to be up for sunrise, I think that's particularly emotionally resonant. And it's right near where the Ukrainian art is as well. Great, thank you all.